So let's continue this conversation around the state of the economy, in particular infrastructure. Let's bring in Bolaji Balogun, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Chapel Hill Denham. He's also the Chief Investment Officer at Nigeria Infrastructure Debt Fund, PLC. Bolaji Balogun has nearly 30 years experience on Broad Street in Nigeria's banking, investment, and securities market. Mr. Balogun, it's good to have you on the program. Thank you very much for coming through.
Thank you very much, Bosun. Good morning.
It's good to see you. First time in the new year. Thank you. It's good to have you here. So let's get this conversation started around what's already in the news around the World Bank, IMF, growth projections for Nigeria for 2019, 2020, 2021, moving forward, looking at a few other African countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. The World Bank says the economy is sleeping. You believe that we can grow the economy. You believe that we can have a productive economy moving forward. So what are your thoughts about these projections from Washington and our own projections inside here within the ERGP and what we've done in recent years?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Bosun. I think the, those numbers are a wake-up call, not only to Nigeria, but everyone on the African continent, that we have an incredible necessity to accelerate the speed and the scale of infrastructure spending across all of our markets. What African economies and what Nigeria in particular needs is a trigger. And that trigger isn't going to come from some of the smaller things that we're doing to improve the business environment. They're important, they're helpful to changing a culture, but the real thing that moves the needle, the big trigger, is to accelerate infrastructure investing. If we think about Nigeria's budget for this year, which is quite a large budget, we're still talking about somewhere in the region of $3 to $4 billion of infrastructure investing. Nigeria needs to be spending $30 to $35 billion. So you're basically talking about 10 times to 12 times as much as we're planning to spend. Now, that's even a bit of a misnomer, because if you sit down and you break down the budget items, what will become very, very clear to you is that elements like cars, furniture in offices are all classified as part of government's capital expenditure project. So what is actually going into infrastructure spend itself is less than $2 billion. It just is not possible in an economy where your population is growing by about 3% a year, which for us means more than 5 million people, for us to be spending less than $10 billion a year in infrastructure spending. Now, what we must realize is that the government on its own cannot do it. What we haven't figured out yet, and I think it's really imperative that we do that sooner rather than later, is that the bulk of that infrastructure spend is going to come from the private sector. We therefore need to be focused on how we engage with the private sector to ensure that we're getting capital, to my mind, into 4 critical areas. We need to get infrastructure spending accelerated first and foremost around electricity. We need to ensure that we accelerate infrastructure spend around energy networks, because we have this beautiful abundance of a natural blessing of incredible reserves of natural gas that we need to convert to power. It's also important that we focus on investing in transportation networks. Finally, in a country that is dominated primarily by young people, we need to focus on accelerating investment into the infrastructure of the youth, or what I describe as the infrastructure of the future, which is essentially broadband infrastructure. If you accelerate spending into those critical areas, what it will do is to attract significant investments. You will get investments going into agriculture, into manufacturing, into retail, into education, into healthcare, into security, into SMEs. And when you do that, that is what creates jobs. It's not the government that creates jobs in an economy. It's investment that creates jobs. And what the government needs to do is to rapidly catalyze and accelerate infrastructure spending. And I think it's important to learn a few lessons that are now becoming very, very apparent to the global community. And the first of those is that infrastructure investing is primarily a long-term local currency gain. One of the key reasons, and many of us don't understand it, but one of the key reasons why Africa has such a paucity of infrastructure investments is that we have overdosed, unfortunately, as a continent, on foreign currency financing of infrastructure. And all foreign currency financing does, when that infrastructure doesn't generate foreign currency, is essentially to make the cost of delivering the infrastructure 4 to 5 times, sometimes even higher than that, over the life cycle of the investment. Now, bear in mind that the users are paying local currency. If you have financed in dollars, there is only one result that occurs, and that is that at some point, there is a currency devaluation, and some people get some indigestion. And it's either the banks who get that indigestion or the financing parties, or it's the infrastructure sponsors and owners themselves who end up with it. But ultimately, the people are suffering, and the people have no infrastructure, and that is a problem that we all have to solve.
Nicely putting this, the background into all of this for us, Bolaji Balogun, quite nice. We appreciate that. Trying infrastructure and investment into inclusive growth. So, based on where we are, the government cannot do it alone. So it needs the private sector. And that brings us to this very important but very naughty conversation on what you call the PPP as first step into getting the private sector to do it. So should we go the way of the Western economies, or do we go the way of China, where the states or the country or the government is the big boy with a deep pocket in infrastructure provision for inclusive growth and for moving people out of poverty?
Well, sure. I think there's only one thing that we want to copy from China, and that's basically to ensure that we are investing in infrastructure over a 10 to 20-year period at a faster rate than population is growing. What China's example has demonstrated exceedingly well over the last 30 years is that if you want your economy growing at 8 to 10% a year, you need to be investing in infrastructure at 15 to 20% a year, growing on a regular basis for a decade or beyond a decade. If you manage to deliver that, then population which is growing at about 3%, essentially, infrastructure is provided for that huge growth and that huge demand which is being created, and we are lifting more people out of poverty. What China has succeeded in doing, which we should copy, and this is where I'm going to stop the copying China, is really to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty through a sustained, consistent, rapid investment in its infrastructure over a 10 to 20-year period. Now, for me, that's where the similarities with China end. Let's talk about the realities of Nigeria's budgetary finances. The reality of it is that this year's budget, which is Nigeria's largest ever budget, is only 6.8% of Nigeria's GDP. Now, what does that tell you? It says that the government is a small and becoming increasingly smaller segment of Nigeria's economy. When you do those numbers, and when you bear in mind, for example, that most of Nigeria's investable pools of capital, and the pension funds probably represent the biggest component of that, are investing primarily in government securities, you will understand Nigeria's development conundrum. And that development conundrum is that 80 to 85% of our biggest pool of savings is financing 7% of the economy. Now, what is quite tragic is that that 7% of the economy, otherwise known as the government, is only spending about 25%, in fact less, on infrastructure spending. So if 80, 85% of your savings are financing 7% of your economy, and only a quarter of that is going into capital expenditure, a fraction of which is infrastructure or education or healthcare, then it becomes quite imperative to you that there is a problem. Who is financing the other 93%? And this is a big development challenge we have as a country, and this is the reason that we have to recognize that public-private partnerships, domestic capital markets, have a really critical and important role to play in the financing of long-term capital for infrastructure, and there are a variety of options and solutions available to us. There is no country in the world, probably with the exception of China over the last 30 years, that has rapidly developed and grown its economy where there hasn't been significant public-private partnership. And we need to get into a mindset where first and foremost the government recognizes the importance of creating the enabling environment for those partnerships. The government recognizes the importance of allowing market forces to a large extent dictate certain elements, including pricing and tariffs. And ultimately, the government must recognize that markets have a far greater capacity to provide the financing and the solutions for infrastructure than its own wallet will. And when we finally find a government, or we find people leading, the economic, leadership in our administration that understand these issues, I think we have begun to solve Nigeria's problems.
Okay, Bolaji, so let's look therefore into what we've tried to do under the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan. We've been on this plan. This is a 4-year plan, and of course it's getting to its midlife and all of that. And our projection is to get hundreds of dozens, several dozens of billions of dollars into this project and grow the economy. So this is a good plan on paper. But again, in terms of its implementation and what our projections are on that particular ERGP, what are your thoughts right now on where we are and why these huge investments are yet to flow in at the speed at which we thought they would come, yet the program is counting days on the calendar?
Bosun, it's an excellent plan, well written. Yeah, I think it has just one fundamental flaw, which I've always highlighted to all of our friends, who are responsible for implementing it. And that fundamental flaw is that the most important issue that you have to deal with, infrastructure, is somewhere in the middle of the plan. Infrastructure needs to be the first thing in the plan because it is the catalyst, it is the trigger, it is the one that sets off everything else. When you talk about diversifying an economy, how do you diversify an economy? It's not talk. It's not just putting money into agriculture. If you invest in power, you invest in cold chain infrastructure, you invest in transportation networks, you will transform agriculture in this country. If you build 6,000 kilometers of rail that take you from all the farming regions of Nigeria and take you to the big cities or to the ports, right? Or alternatively, you build roads, or we build the storage infrastructure along farming belts. What you end up doing is taking agriculture from what it is today, which is low value, into high value agriculture, and that's what transforms a nation. Yeah? When you talk about diversification, diversification cannot occur on a base of old, aging infrastructure. Diversification requires rapid, sustained investments into infrastructure. When you talk about increasing taxes, one of the simplest ways that you grow taxes is to accelerate the investments into infrastructure. Those investments create new businesses and new opportunities. Those new opportunities create new jobs. So firstly, millions more people are coming into the job market. More importantly, more new businesses are being created that will prosper. Those businesses will pay taxes. Because you build transportation networks, property prices are changing. You will be able to charge property taxes. That will increase taxes. Instead, all we have focused on is just trying essentially to shave the same small group of people who have been investing in Nigeria, who have been building businesses, and who have been responsible paying their taxes. That's not the solution. A country that has millions, tens of millions of people in employment must have tens of millions of people paying taxes. And we can accelerate those employment levels very, very significantly. It is these elements that are going to develop the economy rapidly and quickly. And until we focus on them, the ERGP will continue to allow us make small steps, but a country of 200 million people needs to be racing. It needs to be running really, really fast. And the only way that you trigger that acceleration is to bring a tremendous amount of, velocity, into infrastructure investing.
Bolaji, we're going to wrap this conversation around what the private sector, the investment market more appropriately is doing, which is part of what you do. You're the chief investment officers at the NIDF. So Bolaji, talk us through
Sure.
the NIDF,
Sure.
which is the Infrastructure Debt Fund, and what this particular initiative has been able to achieve in raising private capital to plug into what we call the wallet of the government, which is getting smaller by the day, and unlocking the private sector into this very critical initiative of the government. At least the current administration need their support.
So what we've tried to do is to decide that, we can sit and talk and complain, but we also need to do something. So what we've done is we've gone and created this Infrastructure Debt Fund. It's the first one in Africa. There are several of these vehicles in the UK, in Australia, in Canada, in many other, in India, in developed as well as developing markets, but this is the first one that's been created in Africa. What have we done? We go primarily to pension investors, but we also now have, qualified individual investors who are investing. We take money from them and we use those monies to write 10 to 15-year loans on average in local currency. The emphasis being on local currency. We take, the interest, service and we distribute it on a quarterly basis. So since we launched the fund issued at about 101 naira. We have made distributions of nearly 30 naira, 29 naira, 52 kobo since June 2017 when the fund closed. The fund distributes quarterly. It's the best performing fund in this country, amazingly, for a credit fund. It has a total return to date of over 40%, but more than that, it's the impact that it's had on the economy. It's already enabled us to add to infrastructure stock. We're financing captive power plants. We're financing gas networks that are bringing, gas to critical industries and manufacturers across a number of cities. We're beginning now to do social infrastructure projects. We're just about to finance something in educational infrastructure. I hope before the end of this year we might do our first healthcare infrastructure project. We're doing projects in telecoms and adding to broadband capacity. At the end of the day, the fund today can talk about important, measurable impact. And that impact is around adding to infrastructure stock. It's around reducing Nigeria's carbon footprint. It's around creating jobs directly and indirectly. And for me, there is nothing more gratifying for all of the investors who have invested in the fund, including 20 of Nigeria's 28 pension funds, our sovereign wealth fund, and very shortly the African Development Bank will become, our next significant investor in the fund. And this fund, small as it is today, just around $100 million, can already talk about measurable, delivered impact in Nigeria. Now you imagine if this fund were to be $500 million or $1 billion, then the impact would be even more significant. And we need mechanisms like this. We don't want to be the only one.
Bolaji,
we need to use domestic capital markets more. We need to use local currency more. And ultimately, we need to recognize that if we're going to develop this country, domestic capital will play a critical role in it, and there's no point just using our capital to finance the government alone and nothing else.
Bolaji Balogun, we thank you for your time. The Chief Executive Officer at Chapel Hill Denham and Chief Investment Officer of Nigeria Infrastructure Debt Fund, the NIDF PLC. Thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate you being here on Business Morning on Channels Television. Let's take a break. We're back in 2.